Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. As you perhaps saw from the title, I've called this video Aping Aslan, and I'll explain why as we go through the video itself. Part of the reason I did that is I've got Chronicles of Narnia in my head. I've been reading through the series now, and I'm on the very last book, and I'll explain the connection between it and then what we're going to look at in Luke chapter 21, 5 and following. So depending on which lectionary, which system of readings that you follow, that reading from Luke 21 this coming Sunday will be longer or shorter. We're not going to look at the entire discourse that Jesus gives regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, but we're going to look at least a portion of it. And as we do, we're going to draw from the prophets, the Psalms, both the Hebrew as well as the Greek, to help us to understand exactly why Jesus uses the images that he does. I think the Old Testament is going to be very helpful here for understanding much of the language that Jesus uses in this discourse. So we're going to begin with chapter 21, Luke 21, verses 5 and 6. Jesus is at the temple, and here's what happens. While some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, I've added at the end of this slide that the NIV has some of his disciples were speaking of the temple. Now, in the Greek, it does not have any reference to his disciples. Instead, it kind of leaves it generically as some, and probably because Luke wants to cast this particular discourse in a broader sort of way, that Jesus is not just talking to his disciples, but speaking more generally to the public. By the way, the picture that I have up here is one that I took. It's of the Western Wall when I visited Jerusalem. And a lot of people are confused when they see these stones because they're like, hey, didn't Jesus say there's not going to be one stone left upon another? This is not part, the Western Wall is not part of the temple itself. It was a retaining wall that was built by Herod. So these stones, yes, are still there, but that was not in reference, they're not part of the original temple. It's simply part of a retaining wall that was part of the temple base that Herod built when he greatly expanded the temple. So first of all, one of the things I want to point out is that when you're reading through either Matthew, Mark, or Luke's version of this discourse, one of the things that it's a little bit confusing sometimes. You'll ask yourself, well, is Jesus talking about the temple's destruction, or is he talking about the destruction of the world? Is he talking about the temple's destruction by the Romans in AD 70, or like the end of the world's destruction? What kind of, it feels sometimes kind of like he's mixing these two together. Well, that actually should come as no surprise to us, because when we know our Old Testament, we know that the temple was a microcosm of the world. Even the very decorations and the colors and various symbols in the temple were indicative of the fact that the temple was this world in miniature. Therefore, when the temple was destroyed, when this mini world was destroyed, that itself was proleptic, or portrayal beforehand of the destruction of the world at the end of time. So the world's destruction and the temple's destruction are hand in glove because of this cosmic symbolism of the temple in reference to the world at large. So that at least partly helps to explain why there seems to be kind of a mixing and mixing together sometimes of the discourse about the temple's destruction and the destruction of the world at the second coming of Christ. Now, first of all, this talk about how beautiful, how splendid the temple was, that is completely in keeping with what we know of the temple as it existed in the first century. For instance, if you look at these words from Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, from one of his books about the wars. This is book 5. This is in a long, much longer section where he's talking about the temple. But here he says, the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor. Keep in mind the temple faces east, and so of course the rising sun would have been shining upon this golden temple, and it made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away. Of course, it was too bright, just as they would at the sun's own rays. But this temple appeared to strangers when they were at a distance. So they're at a distance and they're looking at the temple. What did it look like? A mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not gilt, that is, not covered in gold, they were exceedingly white. So that kind of gives you an idea as to how beautiful, how magnificent the temple was. It probably belonged on the list of those, those amazing places in world's history. Those constructions, those seven wonders of the world, or however you want to phrase it, that just kind of that took your breath away because they were so magnificent. The temple belonged on a list such as that. Now, it's described here as something which has been adorned. The Greek verb there, kosmeo, is the source from which we get a whole lot of our words in English. We get cosmos and cosmic and cosmology and cosmopolitan and cosmetics, that with which someone adorns herself. Now, this language is actually reflected in the Greek translation, the Septuagint of 2 Chronicles 3:6. This is a discussion of the temple. And there we read that Solomon did what? He kosmeo, he adorned the house. It's talking about the temple. He adorned the house with valuable stones for splendor and with gold. So this language is reflected in Luke 21. Of course, the verb itself, kosmeo, is used in 2 Chronicles as well as Luke 21. And there's mention in Chronicles 3:6 about these valuable stones, lithois timeois. That is almost used verbatim in Luke 21, where it refers to instead to noble stones or beautiful stones, lithois kalois. But the same idea is there. And it's also described as being adorned with votive offerings or with offerings of some sort. This is reflected in the apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees 9:16. Same thing is talked about there, how the temple was adorned with precious votive offerings. Robert Stein in his commentary says that probably what's being talked about here with these offerings that adorn the temple are the ornaments of the temple, tapestries, golden bronze doors, golden grape clusters. All of these were given by people as offerings to the temple. So it was a beautiful structure. It wasn't one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, but it should have been. It just so magnificent, so beautiful that it belonged on such a list. Now, keeping that in mind, it becomes much more, even more jarring when Jesus says what he does about its impending destruction. Now, he says that days will come. Now, this is something that's crucial to keep in mind when we're working our way through these verses. It's easy for us to begin to think that in these verses from Luke 21, Jesus is talking about the end of the world's destruction, his second coming. Now, in the section that we're going to look at, he's not. He's talking only about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and her temple by the Romans in AD 70. So when he says days will come, he's not talking about the end of days. He's talking about what is going to happen in a couple more generations. The same language, by the way, is used elsewhere in Luke. The combination of days and that verb for come, for instance, is used in Luke 5:35. The days will come, Jesus says, when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. Of course, it's talking about his upcoming absence from his disciples. Luke 17:22, same thing. He said to his disciples, the days are coming when you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man. You will not see it. Again, this is not talking about the end times. And the Luke 21:6, of course, is the verse we're looking at. Luke 23:69, same thing. Behold, days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nurse. This is talking about the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem. So don't confuse the language of days will come for Jesus talking about the end, capital T, capital E-N. No, he's talking about the end of the temple, the end of Jerusalem. Okay? So we have the question, people, talking about how beautiful it is, and then Jesus says, hey, there's coming a day when all these stones are going to be rubble, not one left upon another. So we'll find out in what way they respond to this next. So verses 7 through 9. They ask him, teacher, and by the way, this is where these details are important in the Gospel of Luke. That title for teacher is almost always, if not always, used by non-disciples. This is not a term that the disciples use to refer to their masters. So the people asking him this are most likely not his disciples. All right? So they ask him, teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So when and what? Jesus says, in a typical Jesus fashion, by the way. He hardly ever answers a question directly. He says, "See that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place. But the end will not be at once." So I know that I've been stressing this is about the destruction of Jerusalem, but because we are kind of coming up on the end of the church here and we have these readings about the end times, I thought that I would share just about my favorite meme ever. It's this. So, how to accurately predict the exact date of Christ's second coming. Step 1, don't. So, there you go. I know that every year, sometimes more than once a year, these predictions will come up about exactly when Christ is returning. Don't believe it. It's all a lie. Nobody knows. So anytime that someone predicts some sort of exact date for Christ's second coming, you know one thing: they're lying. They do not know. So discount and discard everyone who claims to know such knowledge. It is not known. Christ says, be ready. He doesn't tell us when that day is going to be. Now, back to the text itself. Let's go through a few details here so that we can kind of better understand what Jesus begins to teach us when he sort of answers the questions that they're asking him about what and when. So he begins to say, don't be led astray. Right? There's going to be plenty of things that can lead you astray, but don't be. So pay attention. And he says, first of all, many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Well, don't go after them. We have evidence in Josephus, again, that Jewish historian, in his book Wars, about all the prophets, the false prophets, that arose before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. This was a whole plague of false prophets that were leading people astray. And you don't have to turn to Josephus. Just look at Acts 5, Acts 21, 2 Peter 2, 1 John 2. There's a whole list of New Testament passages that talk about not only the threat of coming false prophets, but the false prophets who have already gone out there and who are misleading many people. What does he mean when he says, many will come in my name, saying, I am he? Well, maybe two or three different things, maybe a combination of these. So some will claim to be kind of under his authority. Now, Jesus sent me to say this. Some will claim to be him, claim to be Jesus himself. And then others will just simply make a messianic claim, claiming that I am the Messiah. I am the one that God the Father has sent. Pay no attention to, and don't go after them. Instead, turn away from them. And this is where I got the title for this, Aping Aslan. So in the very last of the Chronicles of Narnia, in the last battle, C.S. Lewis describes in kind of the opening couple of chapters what's happening. So in Narnia, there is an ape by the name of Shift, and he finds a lion's skin, and he's got a donkey by the name of Puzzle that kind of does his bidding. He does whatever the ape tells him to do. And so what the ape does is he dresses up Puzzle in the donkey in this lion's skin, and then he claims that the donkey is Aslan. And by means of this deception, he leads many astray and he wreaks havoc in Narnia. It's a great fictional telling of what happens when false prophets and false messiahs come. They're aping Aslan. They're pretending to be him. They're pretending to speak in his name. Pay no attention to them. Do not follow them. They're aping Aslan. They are not the true king. They are not the true Messiah. Jesus forewarned us, so let us pay heed. Jesus also says that there will be wars and tumults. Tumults can be translated a variety of different ways, perhaps revolutions or insurrections, something along those lines is probably what's talked about with the revolt of the Jews against the Romans that precipitated the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, this is a case where Israel's history repeats itself, or at least Israel's history rhymes, because we see the same kind of language used back in 2 Chronicles 15, 3 through 7. This is when Azariah is talking to King Asa, and he says, for a long time, Israel was without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. But when in their distress they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. In those times there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for great disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. They were broken in pieces. Nation was crushed by nation, and city by city, for God troubled them with every sort of distress. But you take courage. Do not let your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. So the same language of wars and tumults, of nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, this happened in Israel's history. In fact, the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem happened in Israel's history, right? 586 BC by the Babylonians. Jeremiah warned them before, don't trust in the temple of the Lord. Don't put your trust in this temple because it will be destroyed. So what Jeremiah preached and what happened is the same things happening here. Jesus, in a very Jeremiah-like way, is prophesying the destruction of the temple, and he's saying, don't put your trust in that. It's going to be the Romans, not the Babylonians, but a foreign force, the Gentiles, are going to be sent by God to bring about this destruction. As it happened in the past, so it will happen in the near future in AD 70. The history of Israel rhymes with itself. Now, he also goes on to say, don't be terrified. This is not your typical verb in Greek, by the way, that's used when Jesus says or others say, don't be afraid. This is a stronger kind of verb. So, me petoi thete, don't be terrified. Now, I looked, and interestingly, this is used 3 times, this phrase, in the Septuagint. And it's all in context where there's an overwhelming force of the enemy. And it's that overwhelming force is not to be feared because God will fight for his people. So you can look up 2 Chronicles 20:15 and 20:17 and 2 Chronicles 32:7 for those references. And it fits here with the same idea. You've got wars, you've got tumults, you've got all this stuff going on, these overwhelming forces. It can be very frightening, but Jesus says, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be frightened because all will be well when you follow me. All right, now let's see what happens in the next section. Jesus goes on to say, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. And there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. Now keep in mind, when we hear such language, our mind automatically races to the eschaton. Our mind automatically races to the very end, the second coming of Christ. This is not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the upcoming destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. All right? We're going to get to that more clearly in just a second. But don't, when you hear this kind of language, think that we are racing toward the end. This is all pre-70 kind of activity that Jesus is referring to. So let's look at each of these. First of all, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This is an echo and expansion of what we just looked at in the previous verses. The same kind of language, by the way, is used in Isaiah chapter 19. You can read that whole chapter. It's pretty fascinating. Isaiah 19 is an oracle against Egypt, but it's not just against Egypt. It's talking about how God will actually work salvation later on in Egypt. But at the beginning in verse 2, he says that the Lord's going to stir up Egyptians against Egyptians. Going to stir up or make to rise against Egyptians against Egyptians. They're going to fight one against another, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Now, that verb used in the Septuagint and then the Greek verb used in Luke 21 are basically the same kind of verb. The one used in the Septuagint just has a prefix on it, but it's the same basic root here that's being used. So just like the Egyptians are stirred up against other Egyptians, so we're going to have nation rising up against other nations in Luke chapter 21. Then he goes on to talk about things that are happening on earth. You got earthquakes, and you got famines, and you got pestilences. The last two in that list, famine and pestilence, basically rhyme with each other. They're kind of a pun on each other. So limoi kai loimoi. So famines and pestilences, limoi, loimoi. And as one evidence of that, in the book of Acts chapter 11, this is when you have a prophet by the name of Agabus who comes down to Antioch, and he's in the Spirit, and he foretells that there's going to be a great famine over all the world, and that took place in the days of Claudius. So these things are happening in the book of Acts. These things are all precipitating the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Then you also have not only the terrestrial stuff going on with famines and pestilences, but you also have celestial stuff. So terrors and great signs from heaven. Now, this is typical Old Testament language. This is why, again, it's so crucial for us to look at this through Hebrew eyes. Because, well, to quote Robert Stein's commentary, reference to such signs is frequently made in eschatological or apocalyptic literature. Such descriptions may be used to describe historical events in the future, such as the destruction of Babylon. Isaiah talks about that. The destruction of Pharaoh's army. Ezekiel talks about that. The coming of the Spirit at Pentecost. Joel talks about that, and Peter quotes Joel in his Pentecost sermon. And the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. Amos talks about that. Thus, the description, these things given in these verses, is best understood as referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, if you read Josephus, Wars, Book 6, he talks about such signs occurring before Jerusalem's destruction. So the stuff happening on earth, earthquakes and famines and pestilence, the things happening celestial, all of these is typical prophetic language for what is about to happen before there is some sort of big event, some sort of big God-created cataclysmic event that is about typically a destruction. So the prophets talk about this, that in all those various times and all those various places that I just quoted, and now Jesus is he's talking like a prophet. He's using prophetic language to describe not what happens at the end. It might also fit with the end, but here he's talking specifically about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. All right? So let's see what happens in the very last section that we're going to be looking at. The discourse continues from Jesus, but we're going to stop at verse 19. So this is 12 through 19. But before all this, now that's a significant phrase. We'll come back to that in just a second. So before all this stuff we've been talking about, before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. And you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. So, but before all this, the way that Jesus begins that now makes us kind of realize he's not necessarily been teaching in a chronological sort of way. So think about it. He says, but before all this, that means, so before all that other stuff I was talking about, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to lay hands on you and persecute you. You're going to be delivered up by family and friends. And nation's going to rise against nation, famines, earthquakes, signs in heaven, false prophets, and messiahs. So all these things happen before AD 70 and the temple's destruction. So with all of this in mind, all these things happening to the disciples and earth and heaven and everything else going on, because of that, Jesus says, here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to know beforehand. First thing he says, go ahead and get it in your heads, settle it in your minds, that you're not going to promeletao, that you're not going to meditate beforehand how you're going to give an answer. Why? I'm going to give you a mouth and wisdom. Now, I did a little search here, and I found it quite fascinating that in two of the Psalms from the Septuagint, and then Proverbs 11:2, we have this grouping of three of the words that are used here, at least two of the words, and then a form of the same word. So Jesus says, don't promeletao, which means to meditate beforehand. But this idea of meditate or practice or think about, that verb in Greek, in conjunction with mouth and wisdom, is found in those three verses I have on your screen. So in Psalm 36:30, in the English that would be Psalm 37:30, we have the mouth of the righteous one will attend to wisdom. Psalm 48:4, which again in English is 49:3, says, my mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart understanding. And then Proverbs 11:2 talks about how the mouth of the humble pays heed to wisdom. Now, in each of those cases, you have those two Greek words and that form, a similar form of the Greek verb for meditate in all three of those. So you have this idea that don't meditate, don't think about beforehand, because just like as it's talked about in the Psalms, you have wisdom, you have God giving the words to the mouth, so also you're going to have here. Just like God gave words to Moses, so he's going to give words to his disciples. They are going to give the words that no one will be able to contradict because, of course, they come from the very Spirit of God. All right. Now, he also talks about being betrayed by family and friends. What's going on there? Well, if you look at Micah 7:5 and then Zechariah 13:2 and 3, you'll realize that this is nothing new. Jesus himself is going to allude to Micah 7:5 and 6, where we hear about the son treating the father with contempt, the daughter rising against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, a man's enemies being the members of his own house. Zechariah talks about anyone prophesying, his father and mother who bore him will say to him, "You shall not live." So there's certainly this idea of, in the Old Testament, of family members turning against family members. I mean, we certainly still see this happening in the church today. Sometimes when a person becomes a Christian, whether it's in the United States or anywhere in the world, sometimes the family members turn against that person. Jesus comes to bring a sword, right? There's division, because what he's calling us to is to complete fidelity to him. And sometimes that fidelity means that there's going to be issues with other family members. Sometimes there's persecution. Sometimes there's family members being cut off. Jesus comes to call us to himself, to call us to follow him. And sometimes, of course, along with that comes persecution, comes betrayal, comes people turning their backs on us. As it happened in the Old Testament, as it happened in the early church, as it happened pre-70 AD, so it continues to happen today. Now, finally, this language of not a hair of your head falling to the ground. That we're probably most familiar with from the Gospels, but it's actually an Old Testament image. So 1 Samuel 14:45 says that this is the people talking to Saul, and they're saying this about Jonathan. They're saying, "There shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground." 2 Samuel 14:11, David says, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." 1 Kings 1:52, Solomon says, "If he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth." Now, in the context here, this might strike us as kind of odd, because Jesus has been talking about how some of you will be put to death, but not a hair of your head will fall to the ground. Well, how do you reconcile these two? Well, probably what he's talking about here is the fact that we are safe with our Father, no matter what happens. Persecutions, betrayals, arrest, yes, even martyrdoms, we're safe. We're fine. No matter what happens to us, we are okay. We are safe with our Lord, because he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. He's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and me and you and all those who believe in Jesus Christ. So nothing is going to happen to us outside of his will. Nothing is going to happen to us where we are not safe with God. That promise was faithful and true to the people who lived before the destruction of Jerusalem, which is what Jesus has been talking about here, but it's true for us as well. So as cataclysmic events happen, as threats come, as unwanted family divisions take place, as persecutions or arrest or martyr, whatever happens, as we approach really the end, whenever that's going to be, just like the people hearing this for the first time approach the destruction, the end of Jerusalem and the temple's destruction, we know that when we're with the true King, when we're with Christ, all will be well, because he will keep us safe. He is the resurrection and the life, and so no matter what happens to us, no matter what happens to our bodies, no matter what happens to our loved ones, we are safe with him, because we have passed from death to life in Jesus Christ. We already live in him. And so because of that, all shall be well, because we are with our Lord. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I pray that you all have a blessed Sunday as you reflect upon our Lord's words to his disciples as well as to us today. His grace, mercy, and peace be yours in abundance. We'll see you next week.